There are things that walk between the worlds of the living and the dead, and they have no name that the human tongue can pronounce without the tongue itself trembling. Anonymous Navajo Elder, recorded by Frank Johnson Newcomb, ca. 1930. Historian's preface. When I set out to gather in this volume the accounts, the archaeological fragments of oral memory, the testimonies of generations, and the ethnographic studies accumulated over 2 centuries of contact between the Euro-American world and the indigenous nations of the American Southwest, I did so with full awareness of the weight of what I carried. This is not easy folklore, not the kind of scary story told around campfires to provoke nervous laughter from the young. No, what is found on these pages is something of a far graver nature, far older, and, for those who venture to listen with the ears of historical reason and cultural respect, far more disturbing than any fiction could aspire to be. The Naaldlooshii, a Navajo word that translates approximately as "with it, he goes on all fours," or "the one that gallops on its 4 legs," is the native designation for the being the Western world would come to call, in simplified and often incorrect fashion, the Skinwalker, the skin changer. But reducing this concept to a simple translation is already to commit the first of many possible errors when approaching this subject. The Naaldlooshii is not merely a character from legend. It is not a metaphor. It is not an archetypal symbol invented to explain the terrors of the night. For the Navajo, the Hopi, the Ute, the Pueblo, and dozens of other indigenous nations that inhabit or once inhabited the red lands and stone plateaus of what we now call Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, the Skinwalker is, or was, or may still be, as real as the sand underfoot, as tangible as the cold of the desert at dawn, and infinitely more dangerous than any predatory animal these lands have ever known. I begin, therefore, at the beginning, at the start of everything. Part 1. The land where the gods still walk. The desert that breathes. To understand the Skinwalker, one must first understand the land that gave birth to it. And that land is not a passive landscape, an inert backdrop against which human events unfold. In the cosmological universe of the peoples of the American Southwest, the land is alive. The land breathes. The land watches. The land remembers. The Colorado Plateau, that vast and rugged world of red mesas, canyons cut like wounds in the flesh of the planet, dunes of sandstone that shift from gold to crimson as the sun traces its daily arc, is one of the oldest places inhabited by man in the Americas. For at least 13,000 years, human beings have left their marks here. Cave paintings depicting creatures that no modern zoologist could classify, stone circles whose purpose remains obscure, ruins of entire cities built into the vertical walls of cliffs, as if their builders wanted to be simultaneously on the earth and in the sky, or as if they feared something that walked the ground at night. The Anasazi, the ancestral people of the Pueblo, whose name means, depending on the translation, the ancients or, more unsettlingly, the ancient enemies, built their dwellings at Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde, in Canyon de Chelly, in Chaco Canyon. They built houses of 800 rooms. They built astronomical observatories of a precision that leaves modern archaeologists perplexed. And then, around the year 1300 of the Common Era, they vanished. Not gradually, not spread over generations. They vanished with an urgency that reads in the archaeological remains as panic, pots with food still inside, abandoned over extinguished fires, tools left mid-use, children buried hastily, without the complete rituals that so elaborate a culture would have required under normal circumstances. Archaeologists speak of drought, of war, of environmental collapse. All of this is probably true. But the Hopi, who consider themselves direct descendants of the Anasazi, have another explanation, or rather, an additional explanation, which does not exclude the others but contextualizes them within a worldview where the visible and the invisible were never separate domains. They speak of Powaka. The Powaka is the sorcerer among the Hopi, the being who chose the left-handed path, the path that turns away from cosmic harmony, koiniskatsi, life out of balance, and plunges into the darkness of absolute personal power. The Powaka is one who learned the most obscure secrets of Hopi magic: how to enter the spirit of an animal, how to wear its skin, how to see through its eyes, how to kill at a distance, how to consume the life force of others to prolong one's own life. When the Hopi speak of the abandonment of the great ancestral cities, some elders, those who still preserve the oldest and most secret traditions, say the people left because the Powaka had grown too powerful, that the spiritual corruption had spread like a disease throughout the community, that the only way out was voluntary exile, a fresh start elsewhere, away from stones saturated with ritual blood and spells accumulated over centuries. Whether this is literally true or a metaphorical truth about the social collapse of a civilization, that is a question the reader must resolve in their own conscience. The historian records. The historian does not judge the cosmology of those who lived, but the historian observes, with a certain unease that would be dishonest to deny, that the cultures that arose from the ruins of the Anasazi, the Navajo, the Apache, the historical Pueblo peoples, all preserved, in their most sacred and most feared traditions, the memory of something that existed in that land before them, that exists in that land alongside them, and that will likely exist in that land after them. Something that walks on four legs. Something that was once human. The Navajo creation of the world and the shadow that accompanies it. The Navajo cosmogony, the account of how the world came into being and how human beings came to exist in it, is one of the most elaborate and aesthetically formidable mythic constructions humanity has ever produced. Chanted by the Hatali, the sacred singers, sometimes called medicine men in Western literature, though that translation captures barely half the complexity of the role, in ceremonies that can last up to 9 days and 9 nights without interruption, the Navajo cosmogony is simultaneously a work of philosophy, poetry, medicine, and spiritual cartography. In the beginning, there was total darkness. The primordial beings, creatures that were simultaneously insects, mists, and thoughts, inhabited an underground world of impenetrable shadows. World after world, layer after layer, they ascended, fleeing catastrophes, learning, making mistakes, being punished, and starting over, until at last they emerged into this world, the fourth world, the glittering world, through a hole in the sky the Navajo call Sipapu. In this fourth world, the sacred beings known as the Holy People, among whom are figures such as Changing Woman, Wind Man, and Coyote the Trickster, established the order of things. They created the sun and moon. They created the seasons. They created the healing ceremonies. They created Hazo, the Navajo word with no precise equivalent in English, but which encompasses simultaneously the idea of beauty, harmony, balance, goodness, and peace, as the ideal state of existence toward which every human being should aspire. But from the beginning, there was a shadow. From the beginning, there was Coyote. Coyote is the trickster, the deceiver, the disturber of order. He is not an evil being in the Christian sense, not a Satan, not an adversary of God. He is something more subtle, more disturbing precisely because he is not simply evil. Coyote is the principle of necessary chaos, of essential imperfection, of the death that makes life meaningful. It is Coyote who introduced death into the world, and the other sacred beings, after initial rage, recognized that he was right to do so. Without death, the world would become overcrowded and motionless. But Coyote is also the one whose pranks cross the line from acceptable to terrible. And it is in Coyote's shadow, in the dark edges where the sacred bends toward the profane, where healing power inverts into destructive power, that the Skinwalker finds its origin. According to Navajo tradition preserved by scholars privileged to hear the elders, with the ever-present caveat that the most sacred and most obscure aspects of this tradition are deliberately kept secret from the outside world, the Naaldlooshii is a human being, was a human being, who began its path as a healer, as an apprentice to the sacred ways, who learned the ceremonies, who learned the chants, who learned the secrets of medicinal plants and sand patterns and the invocations that summoned the holy people to help the sick find their way back to Hazo. And then, at some point, a moment of excessive ambition or despair or grief that transformed into rage, or simply a perverse curiosity about what lies on the other side of the line the wise say never to cross. This human being chose the left-handed path, chose the witchery way, and the worst of all the rites of that path, the act that transforms an ordinary sorcerer, an Ant-An-I, one who casts spells, into a Naaldlooshii proper, is the murder of a close relative, a brother, a sister, a child, a mother, someone you love. Someone whose love for you is so complete they would never suspect that death comes from your own hand. This is the price of transformation. This is the currency with which one buys the power to wear the skins of animals, to run faster than a horse, to see in absolute darkness, to enter the homes and dreams of people, to send disease and death at a distance. A murdered love, a shattered soul, and something that rises from the ashes of those two simultaneous acts, the destroyed love and the shattered soul, that is no longer completely human and never can be again. Part 2. Anatomy of a Terror. What the Skinwalker appears to be. Before entering the specific accounts, and there are many, spread across decades of testimonies, ethnographic records, journalistic reports, and, more recently, video documentation of varying quality, it is necessary to establish what the converging traditions describe as the characteristics of the Naaldlooshii. Because unlike what popular entertainment suggests, the Skinwalker has no fixed form. It is not a werewolf that transforms only at the full moon. It is not a vampire with rigid rules about what it can or cannot do. It is something more fluid, more adaptable, and for that reason more frightening. A disruption in the natural order of things that can assume multiple forms, depending on what the moment demands. The animal form. The most documented transformation is the one that gives the being its Western name. The capacity to literally wear the skin of an animal and assume its form. The animals most frequently mentioned in traditions and accounts are the wolf, the coyote, the owl, the raven, and the bear. Not coincidentally, these are the animals that in Navajo and Hopi cosmology carry associations with death, with the transition between worlds, with hidden power. But there is a crucial distinction that the most careful accounts always make a point of establishing. The Skinwalker that assumes the form of a wolf does not become a wolf. It wears the wolf's form like a garment, like a mask. And it is precisely this distinction that makes the experience of encountering it so profoundly disturbing for those who report having seen it. Because a real wolf is a wolf. Its movements carry the unconscious grace of something made to exist the way it exists. But the Skinwalker in wolf form moves in a slightly wrong way. It runs with a speed no real wolf achieves, but with a rhythm that has something human in it. It stops in ways wolves do not stop. It turns its head at an angle that makes observers' stomachs tighten in a way they afterward have difficulty explaining. And the eyes. Always the eyes. Anyone who has seen a wild animal at night, in darkness illuminated only by a flashlight or car headlights, knows that animal eyes reflect light in different ways. Most animals have a yellow-green reflection. Cats have a particular shine. Dogs as well. But the Skinwalker's eyes reflect red. Not the pinkish red of some species. A deep, warm, intelligent red. A red that has nothing of the animal to it, because it has everything of the human. And here lies the core of the horror. It is not the non-human that frightens. It is the all-too-human within the non-human. It is looking at what you believe to be a wolf and seeing, in those red eyes in the darkness, an intelligence that recognizes you, that knows your name, that knows where you live, that knows what you fear most. The speed. One of the most consistently reported elements by those who claim to have had encounters with the Naaldlooshii is the impossible speed with which it moves. Accounts collected on the Navajo Reservation throughout the 20th century describe a creature that keeps pace with vehicles at 60 miles per hour on the desolate roads that cut across the plateau, running alongside the car with the same ease a mediocre jogger maintains on a sidewalk. That appears on the left side of the road and is instantaneously on the right. That was 200 meters away and, in an interval of time too short to measure because it had no measurable duration, is at the window. This specific element, the creature running alongside a car at highway speed, is perhaps the most universal of modern Skinwalker accounts. And it is also the one that most efficiently produces the kind of fear that fear psychology researchers call existential horror. The terror not of being physically harmed, but of having the fundamental structure of reality violated before your eyes. A car at 60 miles per hour is one of the most basic expressions of human dominion over nature. Mechanical speed is one of the first and most persistent symbols of modernity, of triumphant rationality. When something biological matches that speed without apparent effort, running on its own feet or paws alongside a machine, it is not only physical fear the observer feels. It is the sensation that the rules have changed. that there is a system operating beyond and beneath the laws of physics they had learned to trust. The mimicry. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Naaldlooshii is a capacity that traditions consistently describe as perfect mimicry of the human voice. The Skinwalker can imitate the voice of any person. It can call you by name. It can sound exactly like your mother, your spouse, your child, calling for help from outside the window at 3 in the morning. This is not a minor detail. This is, in many senses, the most refined and most cruel of the powers attributed to the being. In traditional Navajo societies, there exists an elaborate set of rules about nighttime behavior that, viewed from outside, may seem like arbitrary superstition, but which, understood in the context of the fear of the Skinwalker, reveals an implacable survival logic. Among these rules, never answer when someone calls your name at night. If a voice from outside asks to come in, do not open the door until you are absolutely certain of who it is. If you are traveling at night and hear someone in distress by the roadside, do not stop. These seem cruel rules. They seem rules that violate the most basic instincts of human solidarity. But they exist because, in the traditions that generated them, the boundary between a genuine human in distress and a being that mimics a human in distress to lure its prey is a boundary you do not see until you have already crossed it, and then it is too late. The Skinwalker's vocal mimicry, in the most elaborate traditions, goes beyond simple voice imitation. The being is said to incorporate speech patterns, mannerisms, specific memories. It can say things that only the person it is imitating could know, to make the illusion complete. And there are accounts, relatively recent, collected by researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, of people who claim to have had full conversations with what they believe to be a relative, only to discover afterward that the relative was elsewhere, and that the creature that spoke with them knew details of their lives that no stranger could have known. How does the Skinwalker know these things? The Navajo tradition offers an answer that is simultaneously simpler and more disturbing than any theoretical elaboration. The Skinwalker watches. For long periods, sometimes for years. It learns. It memorizes. Before striking, before revealing its presence, the Naaldlooshii studies its prey with a patience that is not human precisely because it transcends the human limits of attention and time. The magic powders and the decomposing body. In the most obscure ceremonies of Navajo witchcraft traditions, those that the Navajo themselves hesitate to describe to outsiders, and which researchers find only in the oldest records, made by 19th-century ethnographers who sometimes documented what they should not have, there are references to substances used by the Skinwalker for its purposes. The most terrible of these substances is called E.U.A, human bone powder. Specifically, powder made from the bones of dead children, gathered from cemeteries at midnight. The Skinwalker uses this powder by blowing it over its targets, through an open window, through a door's keyhole, through the ventilation system of a modern house, to induce illness, madness, or slow death. The disease provoked by this powder has no name in Western medicine because it corresponds to no recognized syndrome. It manifests as a gradual and inexplicable deterioration. The target begins to waste away, loses weight without apparent cause, cannot sleep, begins to see things at the periphery of their vision that vanish when looked at directly. Doctors find nothing wrong. Tests are normal, and the person continues to waste. This syndrome, and the disturbing fact is that it appears in accounts with sufficient consistency to have been studied by researchers in cultural medicine, can only be cured by a hatali, a sacred singer who performs specific counter-witchcraft ceremonies. And the cure, when it comes, occurs in ways that Western doctors who eventually encountered these cases describe with perplexity. Patients who had been wasting away for months recover weight and health within days of the ceremony. What this means, clinically, philosophically, or spiritually, is not something an honest historian can resolve. But the pattern is real, and the pattern persists. Part 3. The Records, When History Meets Fear. The Ethnographers and Their Burdens. The first documented contact between Western researchers and the tradition of the Naaldlooshii occurred in the context of the Great Era of American ethnography, in the second half of the 19th century, when the newly consolidated federal government of the United States sent scientific expeditions to the newly conquered lands of the Southwest to catalog, classify, and inevitably attempt to understand the peoples who lived there. Washington Matthews, Army physician and ethnographer of rare genius, spent extended periods on the Navajo Reservation in the 1880s and 1890s. His book Navajo Legends, published in 1897, is still considered one of the most valuable documents of Navajo mythology, and Matthews was notable for the seriousness with which he treated the traditions he studied, without the condescending paternalism of many of his contemporaries, who saw indigenous cosmologies as curiosities of a primitive stage of human evolution. But even Matthews, with all his seriousness and respect, hit a wall when he tried to delve into the darker aspects of Navajo witchcraft. In his private notes, not in official publications, but in the personal diary that remained for decades in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, he described conversations with informants who became visibly frightened when questioned about the Naaldlooshii. Men and women who had spent hours describing complex sacred ceremonies, who had recited chants from memory for him to transcribe, who had explained the most delicate details of Navajo cosmology. These same men and women fell into sudden silence, or changed the subject with an urgency that was itself a message when Matthews pronounced the Skinwalker's name. One informant in particular, Matthews calls her only old woman from Chinle, giving no name, which is itself significant, told him in a tone he described as between serious and terrified. One does not speak of this near houses. One does not speak of this at night. And never, never say his name to an outsider, because if he hears you spoke, he knows where you are. Matthews recorded this phrase, then added, in brackets, in the small nervous handwriting that indicates he wrote this well after the encounter, perhaps at night in his room at the military base. She looked toward the darkness outside while saying this. I do not know why this disturbed me as much as it did. Frank Johnson Newcomb, who lived on the Navajo Reservation for more than 30 years in the early 20th century and became perhaps the most deeply integrated non-Navajo researcher in the community of her era, left even more detailed records of her encounters with the Skinwalker tradition. Her book Navajo Omens and Taboos, published in 1940, contains a section on witchcraft that she herself described as incomplete by necessity. There were things her informants simply refused to tell, and there were things that she, after hearing them, chose not to record. Out of consideration for those who trusted these words to me, and out of a respect I could not explain otherwise than by saying certain things should not be written. Newcomb described a specific incident, which occurred on a winter night in 1921 while she was visiting a Navajo family in their hogan, the traditional circular format dwelling, that she said was the most disturbing event of her long life among the Navajo. She was listening to the family sing an evening prayer when the family's dogs began frantically barking into the darkness outside. The family patriarch, a man Newcomb had been close to for years, described by her as not prone to exaggeration or dramatization, stood up, took the rifle, and told everyone to stay quiet and not look toward the windows. Newcomb wrote, I stood where I was for perhaps 20 minutes, listening to the dogs barking with increasing hysteria, and then, abruptly, stopping. When the silence came, it was of a different quality than normal silence. Heavier, fuller of presence. Name omitted, stood with the rifle for another hour before sitting down. The next day, I tried to ask what had happened. He said only, it's gone. This time it's gone. He said nothing more. And I, who normally persist in questions, found that I did not want to know more. The generation of modern documenters. The 20th century saw a transformation in documentation methods, but not necessarily in the substance of what was being documented. The 1960s and 1970s, marked by a renewed Western interest in indigenous spiritualities, not always respectfully or contextually, but sometimes genuinely, brought new researchers to the American Southwest. Among them, Tony Hillerman deserves special mention, not as a historian, but as the most sophisticated literary documenter of Navajo culture for the English-speaking public. His detective novels, set on the Navajo Reservation and featuring detectives Joe Leaphorn and Jim Chi, incorporated elements of the Skinwalker tradition in ways that Navajo cultural specialists praised for their accuracy. Hillerman was a friend of many Navajos, had access to stories that never reached academic records, and his fictions are, in many respects, more faithful to the real texture of life and fear on the reservation than many ethnographic studies. In his memoir Seldom Disappointed, 2001, Hillerman briefly mentioned that in the research process for his novels, he heard accounts of skinwalker encounters that disturbed my sleep for days, and which he chose not to use in his books because they seemed too large for fiction, too intense, too specific, too charged with a kind of truth that fiction cannot contain without betraying it. This from a man who spent decades writing about the darkest aspects of Navajo culture, who was not given to sensationalism, and who possessed the trained writer's instinct for knowing when a story is good and when it is too good. Part 4. Skinwalker Ranch. When the Terror Left the Reservation. A farm in Utah. No discussion of the Skinwalker phenomenon in the modern context can ignore what happened in the Uinta Basin, in the state of Utah, beginning in the mid-1990s. This story, documented, investigated, contested, ridiculed, and eventually taken very seriously by people not given to ridicule, is perhaps the most extraordinary episode in the long history of encounters between the Western world and the phenomenon that the Navajo tradition calls Naaldlooshii. The story begins with a farm. The Terry Sherman Farm, which would later be known to the world as Sherman Ranch or simply Skinwalker Ranch, sits in Uinta County, Utah, in an area the Ute call Uinta that has a sacred and shadowy history predating by centuries any Euro-American presence. The Uinta Basin, ringed by the Uinta Mountains to the north and sandstone plateaus to the south, is one of the most isolated areas in the continental United States. The small towns in the region, Vernal, Duchesne, Roosevelt, have that particular quality of communities in the deep American interior, self-sufficient, reserved, with a collective memory that does not easily reach outsiders' ears. The Ute who inhabit the region have an old and complicated relationship with the land of the Uinta Basin. They consider it sacred. They also consider it dangerous. And there is a specific detail in the Ute tradition about this particular area, a detail that researchers who came later would discover with growing astonishment, that distinguishes it from other sacred places in the region. The Ute people say this is a place where entities from other worlds arrive, a place that functions, in Ute cosmology, as a kind of portal. They call this place Uinta because Uinta means, in the languages of the Uto-Aztecan family, something that translates approximately as pine place. But there is an older layer of the name, preserved only in the most ancient ritual chants, that scholars of Ute languages have translated as where the spirits enter. Where the spirits enter. In 1994, a family named Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased the 480-acre farm at a price that, at the time, seemed simply a good deal for a remote rural property. They had 4 children. They wanted to start a cattle operation. They wanted the quiet, hard-working life of the American interior. What they found was something entirely different. The first signs that something was wrong on the Sherman farm were, according to the family's accounts, almost ordinary in nature, disturbing, but within the realm of what could, with effort, be explained by mundane causes. The cattle became agitated at night, without apparent reason. That could be a predator, a mountain lion perhaps, or a group of coyotes that had learned there was new easy prey in the area. The family's dogs, which were trained farm dogs with no history of anxious behavior, began refusing to leave the vicinity of the house after dark. That could also be a predator. But then the cattle began to die. And not just to die in ways that veterinarians called to the scene could not explain. Animals found dead with no visible external injuries, no signs of struggle, no indication of a cause of death that available veterinary science could identify. And worse, animals mutilated with a surgical precision that seemed technically impossible for any known predator. Organs removed without blood loss. Cavities opened with edges cut so cleanly they resembled scalpel incisions, not bites or claw marks. Cattle mutilations in the American Southwest are, in themselves, a well-documented and entirely mysterious phenomenon. Since the 1960s, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of cases have been reported in states like New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Montana. The FBI investigated. The Department of Agriculture investigated. No satisfactory explanation was found. The usual suspects, predators, parasites, decomposition accelerated by specific bacteria, do not withstand scrutiny against the best documented evidence. On the Sherman farm, the mutilations were only the beginning. In March 1994, Terry Sherman and one of his adult sons were in a field on the property when they found one of their bulls, an animal of nearly 1,500 pounds, completely motionless in the center of an open field. It was not dead. It was alive. But it was in absolute panic, trembling, its eyes wide with a terror neither of them had ever seen in an adult animal. On the bull's hind legs were marks that the two men described separately as resembling a chemical burn. A perfect circle of bare skin, without hair, without blood, with no sign of healing. And around the bull, within approximately 10 feet, the ground was completely free of snow, on a day when the entire property was blanketed in snow. Terry Sherman was a practical man, a farmer, the kind of person who tends to look for rational explanations for unusual phenomena, because life on the land deals with unusual phenomena all the time. But he stood looking at that circle without snow, at that terrified animal, and felt, according to his later description to the Deseret News, like something was watching me that knew I was watching back. Later that same month, the Sherman family's youngest child, who was then 10 years old, saw from his bedroom window something he described as a huge wolf, but wrong. Wrong in the sense that it moved in a way wolves don't move, and that it had red eyes that didn't blink. The boy stood at the window for several minutes while the creature stood outside, looking at him. Then it left. Not fled, not walked, but simply left, with a speed the boy said he could not describe because it was too fast to be fast. It just was. This description, too fast to be fast, it just was, bears a striking parallel with descriptions of the Naaldlooshii movements recorded in Navajo traditions decades earlier by people who would never have had access to ethnographic records and who lived hundreds of miles away. The researcher and the property. In 1996, Terry and Gwen Sherman sold the property after 2 years of escalating terror. They sold under an unusual condition in the contract. The buyer could not remove any of the existing structures on the farm, a condition that suggests, perhaps, a desire to have everything associated with the place remain there, away from them. The buyer was Robert Bigelow, the Las Vegas real estate billionaire who had founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, with the explicit objective of scientifically investigating anomalous phenomena, including UFO sightings, paranormal activity, and other phenomena that established science tends to ignore or ridicule. Bigelow was a serious man, with serious resources, and NIDS was a serious operation. It hired physicists, biologists, veterinarians, psychologists, former federal agents, and data collection experts to mount permanent surveillance of the property. What the NIDS team documented in the years that followed. And here it must be clearly stated that documented does not mean explained, is one of the most extraordinary lists of anomalous phenomena ever systematically recorded anywhere in the world. Cattle mutilations continued, frequently with characteristics the team's veterinarians described as impossible within the parameters of known biology. Circles of dead vegetation appeared in fields that had been intact the day before. Electronic sensors installed by the team to monitor the property's perimeter failed repeatedly and without identifiable technical cause. Animals disappeared completely from fenced fields without leaving tracks, without damaging fences, without leaving any evidence of how or where they had gone. But what researchers recorded about direct encounters with unidentified entities is what elevates this story from categories of technical mystery to categories of genuine terror. Several NIDS team members reported sightings of creatures that fit no known species. One of the most detailed descriptions, made by a researcher with a biology background who asked to have their name omitted from publications, described a large being, bigger than a bear, but more agile, that they observed through a night vision telescope for approximately 8 minutes before the creature simply vanished, without moving in any direction, without sufficient vegetation to conceal it, without any sign of how it had left the field of view. They said, "I spent my career studying biology. I know how animals move. That was not an animal. That was something using the form of an animal to appear to be what it was not." The phrase, "something using the form of an animal to appear to be what it was not," is remarkable because it corresponds exactly to the description that Navajo and Ute traditions give of the Naaldlooshii. And the researcher, at the time, had no knowledge of the Navajo tradition. Bigelow sold the property in 2016 to a company called Adamantium Holdings LLC, whose owner turned out to be Brandon Fugel, a Utah real estate magnate. for an undisclosed sum estimated at several $1,000,000. Fugel in turn opened the property to filming for a television series called Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on the History Channel, which has been in production since 2020. The series, which brings together a team of investigators with different academic backgrounds, has documented phenomena including anomalies in the magnetic field localized above a specific portion of the property, inexplicable failures of electronic equipment, and at least 2 team members who developed sudden physical symptoms, intense headaches, nosebleeds, disorientation, after conducting operations in certain areas of the farm. Part 5. The Voices of the Reservation. Testimonies the page can barely contain. No amount of scientific investigation, however rigorous, however well-funded, can replace what is contained in the voices of those who live, or lived, or grew up in the shadow of this tradition. The accounts that follow were collected over decades by researchers of different backgrounds and are presented here with the minimum of mediation possible. The account of Joseph Begay, recorded by researcher David Kelly, 1978, on the margins of the Navajo Reservation in New Mexico. Joseph Begay was, at the time of the account, 62 years old. He was a man who had served in the American Army during the Second World War as a code talker, one of the famous Navajo speakers who used their language as an unbreakable communications code, and who had afterward returned to the reservation to work as a tourist guide and, in recent years, as an assistant to a hatali. By every available measure, he was a man of balance, experience, and serenity. He told the researcher that he had had an encounter with what he called Naaldlooshii on an autumn night in 1961, when he was walking back from a visit to relatives who lived a few kilometers from his own home. The night was clear, and the full moon illuminated the path with sufficient intensity for him to walk without a lantern. I was about a mile from home when I heard the sound of someone running behind me. I didn't run. I knew I shouldn't run. I stopped and turned around. It was a figure. It had the shape of a man, but moved in a way men don't move, very fast, but also wrong, as if the legs didn't bend in the right places. It stopped about 20 meters from me. You couldn't make out the face clearly with the moon behind it. We looked at each other for a time that seemed much longer than it was. Then it began to speak. Kelly asked what the figure said. Begay was silent for a moment. It said things that only my mother could know, things she told me when I was a child. It used her voice. It used the way she spoke, with the right pronunciation of our dialect, with the pauses she made. My mother had died 2 years before. It was using my dead mother's voice to speak to me. What did you do? I closed my eyes. I sang a prayer my grandfather taught me. I sang out loud, not very loud, but out loud. When I opened my eyes, it had gone away. I got home and stayed awake until dawn. I never made that walk at night again. The account of Margaret Running Water, recorded by researcher Carol Lee, 1991, Ute Reservation in Utah. Margaret Running Water was 48 years old and a primary school teacher on the reservation. She had grown up hearing the stories about the being her people called Mayun, an entity related to the Navajo Skinwalker, but with its own specific characteristics in Ute tradition. She had been, throughout her adult life, skeptical about these stories, not disrespectful, but skeptical, with the pragmatic skepticism of an educator who had spent her life teaching children to distinguish between what can be verified and what cannot. That changed on a July night in 1989. I was coming back from a teacher's meeting in Vernal. It was around 11 at night, maybe midnight. The road is straight for a long stretch, and I was doing about 50 miles an hour. Then I saw something on the roadside that I thought was a big dog. I slowed down because I was worried about hitting the animal. And when I slowed down, the thing turned to look at me. It was too big to be a dog, too big to be a coyote, maybe the size of a large wolf, but it wasn't on 4 legs, it was on 2. And it had this quality of someone who's been caught doing something they shouldn't. Like when you catch a child doing something wrong and they turn around to look at you. That expression, but on a face that wasn't human, on a body that wasn't human. I looked at the eyes. That was the worst part. The eyes were red and they looked at me as if they knew me, as if they had been waiting for me to stop. I accelerated. I hit 100 miles an hour in the next stretch. When I got home, my hands were shaking so badly The account of Thomas Nez, recorded by Dr. Richard Ellis, University of New Mexico, 1984. Thomas Nez was, at the time, a 22-year-old who had left the reservation to study at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, which made him, according to the researcher, an interesting informant because he moved between two cultural worlds with fluency in both. Nez had grown up in a traditional Navajo family deep in the Naaldlooshii Reservation. The account he gave to researcher Ellis concerned not a personal encounter with the Naaldlooshii, but something his grandmother had lived through and described to him when he was around 12 years old. My grandmother was a woman of great strength. She had helped raise 12 grandchildren, had survived things I won't describe here. She was not a woman who exaggerated or who frightened easily. She told me this once and never spoke of it again. She said that in one winter, she didn't tell me the year, I think it was sometime in the 1950s, she woke up in the middle of the night to a sound at the window. Not a knocking, a scratching, as if someone were slowly dragging their nails across the glass. She lay still and listened. The scratching continued. Then it stopped. And then she heard her own voice from outside. Her own voice calling her husband's name, asking questions she herself had asked him during the day, using her expressions, her pauses, everything. But there was no one outside. She had checked before sleeping, as she always did, and the property was empty. Her husband was awake too. She could feel from the way he breathed that he was awake. They both lay still, without moving, while the thing outside continued using her voice. For a long time. Until dawn. When the light came, they went to check. There were marks on the window. Handprints, but very large, with fingers too long. And there were marks in the snow on the ground around the window that, she said, were not from any animal she knew. And she had grown up in those lands and knew the tracks of everything that lived there. She said the most disturbing thing wasn't the sound. It was what the creature was doing. It was practicing. It was learning how she spoke, how she used words, to use that later. And that, she said, is what sorcerers do before sending the being against someone. They feed at the victim's voice, their mannerisms, their memories, so that when it appears as you, even you yourself cannot tell that it isn't you. Part 6. Science Before the Abyss. When the instruments fail. One of the most fascinating and most frustrating dimensions of the Skinwalker story for scientific thought is the consistency with which measuring instruments fail precisely when they are most needed. At Skinwalker Ranch, the NIDS team documented equipment failures and patterns that the team's engineers and physicists described as not random, but impossible to explain within any model of electromagnetic interference I know. Cameras that worked perfectly before being installed on the property stopped functioning after a few days, with no identifiable technical cause. Motion sensors that had been tested and verified before installation registered movement when nothing was visible. Batteries of all types, from all suppliers, drained within hours in certain areas of the property, while functioning normally in other areas a few meters away. This pattern, instruments failing selectively, in the presence of the phenomenon and not in its absence, is deeply problematic for the scientific method, which requires above all that measuring instruments be reliable. A phenomenon that somehow interferes with the very instruments used to measure it is effectively making itself impossible to study by the methods science has developed. But here one must be careful. The tendency of paranormal enthusiasts is to take this instrumental failure as evidence of the phenomenon. The tendency of skeptics is to take the same failure as evidence of fraud or incompetence. Both tendencies are errors of reasoning. The historian observes only that the pattern of instrumental failure documented at Skinwalker Ranch has equivalents in other locations where similar phenomena have been reported. In the Hessdalen Hills of Norway, for example, where anomalous lights have been photographed since the 1980s and where teams of Scandinavian researchers have documented the same inexplicable equipment failures. The pattern exists. What it means is a question that remains open. Dr. Albert Bose and Cultural Medicine. One of the least explored but potentially most revealing angles of the Skinwalker phenomenon is the medical one. Dr. Albert Bose, a physician who worked for 2 decades in the Indian Health Service on the Navajo Reservation, published in 1987 an article in the Journal of Anthropological Medicine that generated more letters to the editor, both of support and indignation, than any other article in the publication's brief history. Bose documented a pattern he had observed over years of clinical practice. Navajo patients presenting with an inexplicable wasting syndrome, significant weight loss with no identifiable organic cause, severe insomnia, visual disturbances that neurologists could not correlate with any known pathology, who recovered health after chantway ceremonies conducted by Hatali. The question was not whether the cures occurred. They clearly did, documented in patient medical records. The question was why. And the answer Bose proposed, cautiously, with every possible qualification, but proposed, was that the Navajo medical system was effectively treating something that the Western medical system lacked even the conceptual tools to identify. Whatever the Western physician may think about the ontological reality of the Skinwalker, Bose wrote, the empirical fact is that patients presenting with the symptom complex that the Navajo associate with witchcraft attack respond to Navajo ritual treatment in ways that no Western medical treatment has produced. This places the scientific physician in an uncomfortable position. Either they accept that there is a real mechanism being treated by the chantway, or they accept that the ritual produces cures that medicine cannot produce, which is almost equally disconcerting. The article was attacked by one part of the medical community as irresponsible pseudoscience. It was defended by another part, larger than the initial controversy suggested, as an example of scientific honesty in confronting uncomfortable data. Bose, who at the time was 52 years old with 2 adult children, said in an interview with the Albuquerque Journal some months after publication, "I spent 20 years trying to care for people in these lands. The most dishonest thing I could do would be to ignore what I saw because it doesn't fit the categories I learned in medical school. The categories are tools. The people are real. What happened to these people is real. And what cured them is real. The rest is philosophy, and philosophy doesn't take anyone's pain away." Part 7. The Navajo Cosmos and the Place of Evil. Hazo and its Shadow. To understand why the Naaldlooshii occupies the place it does in the Navajo worldview, not merely as a monster for storytelling, but as a central element of the culture's moral and spiritual philosophy, it is necessary to understand the concept of Hazo and its opposite. Hazo is often translated as beauty or harmony, but these translations capture only a fraction of the word. A more complete translation would be the state of perfect balance among all elements of existence, in which the individual is in harmony with the collective, the human with the natural, the visible with the invisible, the present with the past, and the future. It is the state toward which all Navajo ceremonies point. It is what one seeks to recover when someone falls ill. It is what is celebrated in rites of passage. It is the quality the Navajo recognize in nature when snow covers the red mesas uniformly, when the monsoon rain arrives at the right moment, when a baby is born healthy. And then there is the opposite, hachu, disorder, imbalance. The state in which the planes of existence have fallen out of alignment, in which the individual has turned against the collective, in which the power that should flow through the cosmos in an orderly manner now flows in a predatory one. The Naaldlooshii is not simply a malevolent being. It is the personification of hachu. It is what happens when a human being deliberately and consciously chooses to place themselves outside of cosmic harmony and uses the power that position confers to consume the harmony of others. It is, in philosophical terms, the parasite of order, the being that can only exist while there is harmony to destroy, that feeds on others' balance, that grows in exact proportion to the diminishment of Hazo around it. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated philosophical idea, and it has a disturbing parallel in certain forms of biological parasitism. The virus that can only replicate inside a healthy cell, that kills the host while dying with it. The parasite that manipulates the host's behavior to maximize its own transmission. Nature independently produced the principle that Navajo cosmology encoded in the figure of the Skinwalker. The price of power. One aspect of the Naaldlooshii tradition that is rarely addressed in popular discussions of the subject, but that is central to the understanding indigenous cultures have of the being, is the tragic dimension of the Skinwalker. It was human. It began as human. Perhaps it began with good intentions, as a healer, as a protector of its people, as someone who wanted enough power to protect those it loved from a world that was not gentle with them. And then it crossed the line, killed someone it loved. And in this act, something died in it as well. The part that could have returned, that could have repented, that could have found its way back to Hazo. The Navajo elders who speak about the Skinwalker, and few speak, and none speak freely, describe an existence that is, in certain respects, a form of hell. The Skinwalker lives alone. It cannot maintain genuine human relationships because absolute power depends on absolute secrecy, and absolute secrecy is incompatible with intimacy. It cannot be healed by the rites that heal others, because it deliberately placed itself beyond the reach of healing. It cannot die normally because it extended its life beyond natural limits through the consumption of others' life force. But this extended life is a life of perpetual predation, perpetual isolation, of a power that can never be used for anything but more power. It is an existence the tradition describes with a word that has no precise equivalent in English, but which approximates a hani, a state of being that is beyond help, beyond redemption, beyond return. Not because the universe abandoned the Naaldlooshii, but because the Naaldlooshii abandoned the universe. And perhaps the most frightening thing about this description is that it sounds less like a fairy tale monster and more like a psychological diagnosis. Part 8. The Pursuit. Accounts of confrontation. When humans confront the unconfrontable. There exists in the tradition a category of accounts that is rarer and more disturbing in its specificity than simple sightings. These are the accounts of direct confrontation, situations in which a human being not only encountered the Naaldlooshii, but attempted to face it, or was somehow able to observe it more closely than the fleeting glimpses that make up the majority of accounts. One such account, fragmentary, collected in pieces over multiple conversations by researcher David Kelly during the 1970s, involves a Hatali identified only by the respectful title of the Old Singer of Naaldlooshii, a mountainous area in northeastern Arizona that has, in Navajo traditions, a special reputation as a concentration of spiritual power, both benign and malign. The Old Singer had, according to the account, been called to a remote encampment to conduct a healing ritual for a sick child. It was winter, and the mountain path was difficult. He went on foot, as was his custom, carrying only his medicine bag. On the way back, well past midnight, he noticed that something was walking behind him. He did not run. He stopped. He turned around. It was a human figure, more or less. Too tall, with proportions slightly wrong in a way the eye caught, but the mind resisted processing. Wearing what appeared to be an animal skin coat, but the skin seemed alive, seemed to pulse, as if something were still inside it that was not the wearer. The Old Singer looked at the figure for a long moment, and then, according to the account, he did the least intuitive thing possible. He walked toward it. The figure retreated. The Old Singer kept walking toward it, singing softly one of the protection prayers he had known for decades. The figure continued retreating. He said, later, that he had felt something like the smell of dead animal mixed with something that wasn't animal, something that was human but rotten in a way that wasn't of the body, it was of the soul. The figure retreated until it vanished into the pine forest. The Old Singer arrived home at dawn. He fell ill over the following 3 days, an illness he described as like something trying to enter where the eyes see and the ears hear, with intense headaches, blurred vision, and a sensation he compared to having a hand inside the chest trying to grab something. At the end of the 3rd day, he conducted a cleansing ceremony for himself, and the illness passed as abruptly as it had arrived. His interpretation of the episode, according to Kelly, it didn't retreat because I caused it fear. It retreated because I recognized it. And those who walk in that shadow do not wish to be recognized for what they are. They want you to think you're seeing an animal, or a shadow, or a dream. The moment you look and say, I know what you are, you've taken from them the most powerful weapon they have. The hunter and the hunted. There is a disturbing inversion in several accounts of the Naaldlooshii. The question of who is hunting whom is not always immediately clear. Several accounts describe people who believe they were fleeing the creature, only to discover, usually through some telling detail, some inconsistency in the being's behavior, that the creature had actually been guiding them to a specific place, guiding them away from help. The account of an anonymous truck driver collected by journalist George Knapp, the same who would later investigate Skinwalker Ranch, describes a journey along Highway 491 in New Mexico, a road with its own history of sightings that locals call the Devil's Highway. On a summer night in 1989, the truck driver saw what he thought was a coyote on the roadside. Then the coyote began running alongside the truck at the same speed. For several miles, the truck driver accelerated. The creature kept pace. At 60 miles per hour, the creature was alongside the truck, less than 10 feet away, looking at him through the passenger window. He described the eyes, red, intelligent, with an expression I had no way to describe at the time because it was a human expression on a face that wasn't human. He also described a smile. It wasn't an animal smile. It was a smile like that of a person who knows something you don't. Like they had a plan and the plan was working. The truck driver exited Highway 491 at the first turnoff he found and didn't stop until he reached the nearest gas station, where he stayed until dawn. He never made that route again. But the detail Knapp highlighted in his report, and which is the most disturbing element of this episode, the exit the truck driver took led to an isolated stretch of secondary road that ended, about 9 miles from the 491, in a box canyon. He only realized this when he was almost at the terminal point. He managed to turn around before reaching the dead end. He had not consciously chosen that exit. He had simply felt it was the right one. When he looked back toward the canyon entrance, there was nothing visible. But there was, he said, that feeling of something retreating into the shadows. Like when you walk into a room and know someone was there a second ago, but isn't anymore. Part 9. The Ritual. How one becomes a skinwalker. Historians note. What follows is a reconstruction based on fragments of oral traditions recorded by multiple researchers over more than a century. It is presented here with full respect for the sacredness of the traditions that contain it, and with the awareness that the totality of ritual knowledge belongs to the cultures that generated it and was never, nor could be, completely transmitted outside them. The purpose is not sensationalism, but historical understanding. The path that must not be walked. The Navajo tradition distinguishes among several types of magic practitioners. There is the Hatnali, the sacred singer, healer, who uses their knowledge to restore Hazo. There are the lesser Hatalii, those who know specific ceremonies for specific problems, like medical specialists. And there are, on a continuum that runs from the marginally acceptable to the absolutely forbidden, the practitioners of the witchery way. The witchery way is not necessarily evil at its most basic levels. There is protective magic, there is counter-witchcraft, there are practices the community accepts as necessary to defend against spiritual attacks. But as one delves deeper into this path, the methods become more obscure, the ingredients more forbidden, and the personal price more devastating. At the deepest level, the level that creates the Naaldlooshii proper, there is an initiation process that ethnographers describe consistently over decades. A ceremony conducted inside caves in specific locations, far from any human habitation, during the darkest night of the lunar cycle. A ceremony that deliberately and systematically inverts all the healing and harmony ceremonies the aspiring practitioner has learned. Where the healing chant way uses grains of corn in specific colors to create the beautiful sand patterns representing cosmic harmony, the Skinwalker ceremony uses bone powder and ash. Where the healing chant way invokes the holy people by their true names with gestures of honor, the Skinwalker ceremony invokes them inverted, through the reverse of their names, with deliberate gestures of insult. And at the center of everything, the act that cannot be undone, the act that closes the door back to the human world, the death of someone loved. The most detailed versions of the tradition specify that not just any death produces the transformation. It must be a death the loved one cannot anticipate, cannot defend against, cannot understand. A death that destroys not just the body but trust, that kills twice. Once the body, and once the fundamental belief that love is safe. And when this act is completed, when the beloved is dead and the betrayal is complete, something changes in the perpetrator that cannot be described in purely psychological terms, though psychological terms certainly apply. The tradition says the human soul has a specific quality that is like a mirror. It reflects the cosmos, reflects Hazo, reflects the interconnection of all beings. And that the act of killing what one loves shatters that mirror in a way the fragments can no longer reflect anything whole. What remains is not emptiness. What remains is a power, a new and terrible capacity, the capacity to wear the forms of animals, to move between worlds, to enter dreams and homes, to send illness and death at a distance, through the powers once used to heal, and a hunger that is never satisfied. Part 10. The final confrontation, the question of reality. What the historian can say. We arrive at the point where the honest historian must confront the question the reader has certainly carried throughout all these pages. Is this real? And here it is necessary to be precisely precise about what the question means. If the question is, do supernatural beings literally transform into animals and pursue human beings along the roads of the American Southwest? Then the historian has no way to answer affirmatively. The historical method does not deal with supernatural claims. It has no tools to verify or refute them. It simply declines jurisdiction. If the question is, have real people, over centuries, had experiences they described in consistent ways that produced documentable effects on their lives and the lives of their communities? Then the answer is unequivocally yes. That is documentable. That is historical. That is real in the most basic sense of what real can mean for the study of human experience. And if the question is, does something exist, whatever it is, of whatever nature, that occurs in these lands, that indigenous traditions encoded in the figure of the Skinwalker, that Western researchers have recorded with growing perplexity, that residents of the region describe with a consistency that cannot be explained by simple cultural contagion, and that produces measurable effects both in human behavior and, apparently, in physical measuring instruments? Then the historian observes only that the answer, based on the sum of available evidence, is that yes, something exists. What that something is ontologically, whether it is a collective psychological phenomenon of extraordinary intensity, whether it is an unknown physical force, whether it is literally what indigenous traditions say it is, remains an open question. A question that science does not yet have the tools to close. And perhaps, this is a speculation the historian offers not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. Perhaps the traditions that encoded this phenomenon in the figure of a being that was once human, that chose power over love, that now lives in a state of perpetual predation and absolute isolation, have captured something essential about the nature of what they fear. Whether the Naaldlooshii is literal or metaphorical or something that transcends both categories, it is the embodiment of a truth that all human cultures have come to recognize in different ways, that there is an abyss toward which certain kinds of choices lead, from which one does not return. That absolute power erodes the humanity of the one who holds it in a way that is, in its own form, a kind of death. That there is a price for certain things that cannot be paid without destroying what made the payment worthwhile. And perhaps the specific terror of the Skinwalker, the terror that makes cautious Navajos, that sends researchers home with insomnia, that makes truck drivers accelerate to 100 miles an hour in the desert darkness, is precisely this. Not the monster itself, but the recognition, in looking into the red eyes in the darkness, that this being was once as human as we are. That the distance between us and it is measured only in choices. Epilogue. The land still remembers. Today, Highway 491, previously known as Highway 666, the number of the beast, which was renumbered in 2003 in response to local communities' concerns about the sightings and accidents occurring there with a frequency that was statistically inexplicable by traffic volume or road conditions, still cuts across the Colorado Plateau between New Mexico and Utah. There are still sightings. There are still accounts that reach the editors of local newspapers, the call lines of paranormal researchers, the pages of internet forums where people who have never met each other describe the same creature running alongside their cars, the same red eyes in the darkness, the same impossible speed, the same smile that does not belong to any animal. And there are still, in the hogans scattered across the vast interior of the Navajo Reservation, the Hatali who intone their 9-day ceremonies for patients who have been wasting away for reasons no Western doctor has identified, who sing the sand patterns into beauty, who invoke Hazo, harmony, the lost balance. Against what do they sing? The land knows. The land remembers. In the darkness between the red mesas, in the early hours when even the coyotes fall silent and only the wind through the rocks makes any sound, the darkness between the red mesas does not say, but it listens. Historical notes and sources. Primary traditions consulted. The Navajo oral tradition, as recorded by Washington Matthews, Navajo Legends, 1897, Frank Johnson Newcomb, Navajo Omens and Taboos, 1940, and Clyde Cluckhone, Navajo Witchcraft, 1944, Harvard University Press, the latter considered the most complete academic study on the subject. Ethnographic records. The works of David M. Brugge on Navajo history. The studies of Gary Witherspoon on language and cosmos in Navajo culture. The records of the Bureau of American Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution. On Skinwalker Ranch. The book Hunt for the Skinwalker, 2005, by Colm Kelleher and George Knapp documents the NIDS investigation. George Knapp's investigative work for Las Vegas Station Class are the most complete journalistic records of the story. On cattle mutilation. FBI reports on investigations of cattle mutilation in the American Southwest, available through the Freedom of Information Act, are of independent historical interest. On cultural medicine. The works of Dr. Lori Alvord, the first Navajo woman to graduate from Dartmouth as a surgeon and author of The Scalpel and the Silver Bear, 1999, offer a unique perspective on the interface between Western and Navajo medicine. A final note. This text was written with respect for the traditions it describes. The most sacred aspects of Navajo ceremonies, the specific chants, the detailed sand patterns, the true names of the entities involved, have been deliberately omitted out of respect for the cultural prohibitions that surround this information. The reader who wishes to deepen their study should do so with humility, patience, and attention to the voices of the communities that guard these traditions. There are things one learns from books, and there are things one learns only when the night covers the red mesas and the wind suddenly stops and the dogs, for some reason you don't understand but instinctively respect, go silent. In those hours, the best advice is what Navajo elders have given for centuries: stay inside. Light a candle. Sing, if you know anything to sing. And if you hear your own voice calling your name from outside the window, do not answer.